Okay.
I just want to thank everyone who's logged in today to the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and University of Wyoming Sheep and Goat webinar series. We're really grateful to have you guys here. Today, I'll be speaking somewhat on behalf of our other collaborators, including Melinda Ellison, Dr. Melinda Ellison, and Carmen, who are with the extension program at University of Idaho, and also Dr. Whit Stewart, who's with the University of Wyoming. Before we get going, I just wanted to remind anyone who is going to have any questions throughout the duration of this presentation that if you do have questions, please write them in the Q&A portion on Zoom. If you write them in the chat, they tend to get lost, and in the Q&A portion, we can kind of keep track of the questions a little bit better. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from David Hartman, who is with Extension at Penn State. We're really grateful to have him here today to talk about pasture management and grazing. David got an animal science degree at Penn State, followed by a forage agronomy, a master's degree. And so he's well-rounded in production agriculture as far as it relates to livestock production. He also is an owner of his own Katahdin flock. And so we're really grateful to have him in here to share his expertise with all of us on all things kind of sheep and goat. So David, we're really grateful to have you, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
All right, Chad, thank you very much. Well, I'm really glad to be able to present today as well. We did this presentation back in February for a webinar sponsored by Penn State, and I was happy when Melinda asked me if I'd be able to share it for the group today, and I was glad that it would work out. Right now I'm in the northern part of Pennsylvania. We're running a series of meetings which started last night. We did a meeting last night, the same meeting tonight in a different county, and the same meeting tomorrow night in a different county for beef producers. And we also threw in some information about adding small ruminants to existing beef operations with the current good state of the sheep and goat markets. It's got people excited, and some folks are looking at adding sheep as an enterprise or goats. And the other thing too in Pennsylvania is we've had a fair amount of attrition from the dairy business, especially in the northern part of the state in the last several years, which leaves some pasture land available and infrastructure that can be pretty easily converted to either beef cattle or sheep and goats. So we're trying to offer the education that we can. So anyways, we're going to talk a little bit about mainly about how we can add more days to the grazing season. What kind of things can we do to extend our season for these ruminant livestock enterprises? Feeding animals is the biggest part of the expense picture. And within feeding, the cost of winter feeding is the biggest expense within feeding. So if we can whittle away a little bit at the amount of time that we have to feed during the winter and be able to provide more of that by grazing, we can probably make our operation more profitable. And so we're going to talk about ways that we can add more days to the grazing season. So when I used this term years ago for a different presentation I put together for cattle owners, and I used the term wrangling, and then I thought, well, maybe that's not very good for sheep owners. So I used a little secondary topic there, shepherding your way to a more successful grazing program. So we're going to talk about some things that we can do to improve grazing management, which will impact the longevity of our grazing season. We'll talk a little bit about some reseeding options, and then some methods that we can actually use to extend the grazing season by various options. And I apologize, and I know Idaho is a very diverse state, probably has more diversity in the climate conditions and elevation and farming versus range or those sorts of things than Pennsylvania has. So I'm hoping that everybody will be able to at least grab something out of this presentation to cause them to think a little bit about their own operation and how they might be able to do some things. It's not all going to be applicable probably to your situation, but I'm hoping that some of it will be. And I'd like to see pasture not get relegated to the no management category. Okay, it's probably where you're at. We have really intensive management of a lot of different enterprises and crops in agriculture, but oftentimes pasture, unfortunately, has been sort of relegated to that status of, well, we don't need to worry about that. We'll just use what happens or use what grows and hope for the best. But there's some things we can do to ramp up that level of management and reap the benefits. It's, even a small amount of time invested in what we do can really make some difference. We have a lot of really good fencing materials available these days. There's various forage crop options. We know more about how to manage pasture than we did 50 years ago. So we can apply some management and reap the benefits from that. We need to really think about pasture as a long-term investment. All right. It's something that we can, treat like maybe a piece of machinery. We're buying something to invest in our business, and a permanent pasture can be looked at the same way. I'll start with ground up. We'll just, basically this slide relating to soils and soil health. A lot of interest these days in soils and soil health, and I'm really glad to see that. I think years ago, the specialists that I interacted with at Penn State, these fellows were mainly either specialists in soil chemistry, or they were specialists in the physical aspects of soil, and soil biology just really wasn't talked about much. And that's kind of like the third leg of the stool. Okay. So we have to understand the physical aspects of soil as well as chemical aspects of it, and now biological. So there's a lot of interest in this kind of thing right now, and I'm glad that there is. I think we all knew years ago that there was a lot to learn about biology of soil, and so now we're getting there, and there's a lot being learned all the time. And so the other thing we know is that well-managed pasture can lead to high levels of soil health. If we can manage our pastures in various ways, we can impact the soil health in a positive way, which can help our business. I would recommend people periodically test soil for the pH, all right, to have an understanding of is your soil acidic? Is it too acidic? Is it able to, are the plants we're trying to grow for pasture able to tolerate the pH where we're at, whether it's high pH or low pH? It's good to know that basic aspect of the soil chemistry, as well as the major macro minerals, major nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, these sorts of things. So test the soil every now and then. In Pennsylvania, we've told people every 3 to 5 years to just see how it changes over time and whether or not you need to do it to change the fertility status of the soil. Just a little bit about ruminants, the ruminant GI tract. Of course, really when we're talking about grazing animals here, we've got some concern about, all right, we're going to start up here with the lips and the mouth of these critters. And I put the pictures of this steer here looking out over the fence, and then the ram. What I wanted you to see there was the difference in their anatomy, basically, their lip structure. The ram there looking at us at the bottom, he's got that split upper lip, and versus the steer there does not have that. And so this impacts the way sheep and goats are able to graze compared to cattle. Cattle tend to reach out with their tongue and pull forage in and sort of tear it off, whereas the sheep and the goat can manipulate forages a little bit more, and it allows them to be a little bit more selective in what they graze. So we have to be cognizant of that when we're trying to manage grazing for these creatures. Then that's, of course, followed by the esophagus. And then the 4 that I have in red there would be each of the 4 chambers of the ruminant four chambered stomach. So the rumen, of course, is where a lot of the action takes place as far as digesting fibers and plant material that would not otherwise be able to be utilized by the ruminant. And of course, the abomasum is the more true stomach, gastrostomach, similar to ours. And of course, then we have a small and a large intestine as well. Grazing versus browsing. And the way I like to explain it to people is sort of like this. If we just sort of put this thing on a gradient or a continuum, cattle prefer to graze if they have the opportunity. Goats generally prefer to browse if they have the opportunity, and sheep are sort of somewhere in between. They can go either way pretty quickly. There's even some variation by breeds as well. But the point I like to make is that all ruminant livestock species will do what they have to do to make a living. All right. If you've got pasture goats and you don't have anything to browse, they'll need to graze, and that's what they'll do. I do know some folks that have cattle that run pretty serious silvopasturing operations, and part of those cattle is they've got to learn how to do more browsing as opposed to grazing all the time. So, but the point is that they'll adapt to do what they need to do. How many animals will my land support? So when you start reading information about grazing or look at articles in the popular press, you'll see these terms popping out sometimes: stocking rate and stocking density. And I'd like to try to clear up any confusion for folks with that terminology if we're talking about grazing. So when we're talking about stocking rate, that's more of a bigger picture term is what I would call it. We're talking about the number of animals or live weight across a longer period of time, like a whole grazing season, across the whole farm or the whole grazing unit. It's going to depend on things that affect the carrying capacity of that land, soil quality, of course, and the productivity of soils. Where I'm at, it varies greatly. And we have soils in Pennsylvania that'll produce 300 bushel per acre corn, and we have other soils that people try to farm or that they graze that would struggle to produce 100 bushels of corn per acre. So we have a lot of difference in the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is also impacted by the pasture quality. Is our pasture in good shape and growing aggressively, or is it weak or overgrazed, that type of thing. And of course, management comes in there as well. If we're mismanaging things and we're doing things like overgrazing, that's going to impact what our stocking rate is able to be for that farm. And it's interesting to look at your stocking rate over time, from year to year, and have an understanding of that concept. Stock density or stocking density is typically measured in live weight of animals. So whether we're talking about sheep or goats or cattle, we look at that on a weight basis. We're talking about the amount of weight that's right here, right now, per acre. And so you'll sometimes see articles about people using high density grazing or mob grazing, where the animals are stocked in pretty tightly. It's a dense situation. Maybe they're being moved several times a day. Okay, and that's if we take just that small part of pasture that's being grazed right now, and look at the amount of live weight there. That's an indicator of the density that we're using. And again, it's interesting to keep track of that and have an understanding of it on your farm and how it impacts what happens in your pastures. How many animals can my land support? So we get this question quite a bit, and it's, your extension people in Idaho probably tell you the same thing that we tell people all the time, is that a lot of our answers begin with the two words, it depends. And this is one of those it depends kind of things. It depends on a lot of things, but I like to speak in ranges when it comes to this. And in Pennsylvania, in our conditions, we're talking about probably 4, 5, or 6 ewes per acre typically, and perhaps a few more meat goat does. So what I tell people is if you're getting into this for the first time, or you're new to the business, trying to figure out what to do, start with a low rate. Start really on the conservative side and sort of work your what seems to be something that a stocking rate that makes sense for your farm. All right. Kind of a friend of mine years ago who grazed stocker cattle told me he kind of started with a lower number and sort of worked up to what he felt was he put it drought safe number. So if we have a drought summer, and droughts for us in Pennsylvania probably are different than you may consider a drought, but it's you have to work your way up to that number and find a stocking rate that you're comfortable with. It's possible to run sheep and or goats with cattle. There's been research done in several different places where we can run, for example, a ewe or a doe for every cow we have and not need to reduce cow numbers, and not need to increase acreage. So they eat enough different things. Sheep would graze around cattle manure, vice versa. So we have some advantages like that can impact what we're able to do as far as what our land supports. As far as taking out brush, and this is a big it depends, but the book values I've been able to find are somewhere in the range of 8 or 10 sheep or goats per acre to take out brush and actually eradicate it. So you'd have to experiment with that if you try to get into that type of thing. A little bit about grazing management. All right. So what we do during the whole season, as far as how we manage our pastures, really impacts the length of our grazing season. And if we're making a lot of mistakes along the way, the season might sort of cut us off a little bit early. So we want to be careful about what we're doing the whole season to try to lengthen things out. I recommend people don't get caught up in a lot of fads. Try to keep things pretty simple. If you've been at it a lot of years, it's one thing. But sometimes I think people are maybe quick to want to jump on a bandwagon or this one or that one or some other bandwagon and go along with some of the latest fads. But I think it's good to just stick to some basic, simple things that we know work and learn by doing as you're going along. Talk to people with experience. If you're new in grazing livestock, go to some meetings and get acquainted with some producers in your neighborhood and try to learn from other folks. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit to learn some things that might work on your farm. We tell people to just, start dividing pastures up. If we've got one big old pasture and we're continuously grazing, if we can divide that down into 4 pastures, that's going to probably take us in the right direction compared to just one big pasture alone. And so we want to think about making smaller paddocks. The whole idea is to allow forage time to recover and rest and regrow, regenerate, put roots back down into the soil while we're leaving it rest. So, and we move livestock through these on a rotational basis. Typically for these cool season forages, the recommendation is to leave 3 or 4 inches of residual forage after grazing. And what we want to avoid is grazing forages down to the dirt, basically, and forcing them to have to regrow from the energy that's stored in their roots or in the very, very bottom of the stem. It's nice to be able to maintain some leaf area and allow that plant to continue photosynthesizing and generating energy so that it has a good jump start on regrowing after we move our livestock out of that pasture. We would aim for an occupation time anywhere from, I tell people 1 to 7 days, and that's more from a sort of a simplistic view. And we have a lot of folks raising livestock in our part of the country who are part-timers. They work a job off the farm and, moving livestock every day. And I've seen people try to do this and they have another demanding job off the farm and they get themselves burned out. And I think, we have to apply some common sense to this. And if it's going to be that we move our sheep and goats over the weekend, we move them once a week, that's probably going to work pretty well. Ideally, A little bit less than that would be great. If we can move them every 3 days or so, that would be better. And typically beyond about 3 days, we're starting to get some regrazing of forage plants, individual plants that were grazed the first day that animals were put into that paddock, and that can tend to set that plant back pretty when it's trying to generate energy if we graze it twice within 3 days. So the idea is to get some animals, get them out of there after a few days so that they don't regraze where they were the first day. The other thing too, when we're talking especially about small ruminants, you're probably aware, if you've been in this business, and if you haven't been in this business for long, you're looking to get into it, parasites are an issue. And so these are internal parasites. So the sheep and goats can pick up these larvae for the parasites from the lower stems and the bottom of a plant. And so if we're forcing animals to graze down fairly low, we can make our parasite problems worse. So we need to keep that in mind when we're managing grazing. We can help our parasite management issue by managing grazing correctly, and typically the agronomic part of that and the protection from parasites meshes, and it goes hand in hand. So something to think about there. A little bit more about grazing management. We're trying to allow rest period, like I mentioned earlier, to allow the forages to rest and recover and regrow. And again, your situation may be a little bit different where you're at. It's the concept that I want you to understand here. For us in the springtime here and next month in May, our forages are growing so fast we don't know what to do with it all. But we could regrow, or we could regraze perhaps in 15 days, 20 days, something like that. But in summertime, it's going to be probably 30 or more. And we have to take that into account when we're planning our grazing for the season, and have a way that we're going to be able to lengthen out the rest periods and work that into the whole picture. This is just a simple formula here that's been around for a long time, just to help people understand how to calculate how many paddocks do we need. Okay, if I've got a farm here and I'm working on this for the first time, we can look at it just this simple way. Paddock number is equal to the rest period plus 1 divided by the grazing period. And I just use a really simple example here at the bottom. If we are intending to rest our pasture for 20 days, we add that 1 on there for the pasture we're on at the time, and we're going to say we're going to graze for 3 days. That means 7 paddocks should service that situation pretty well. And again, get the basics right before getting too fancy with things. We've got to be able to walk before we can run. So if we get those basics right, that's good. In my career, I've been at this for almost 37 years now, and had a lot of different responsibilities and interacted with people with a lot of different questions on a lot of different ag commodities or enterprise areas. And sometimes I know that we've got people asking questions that are just overly complicated when I know that the basics aren't in line. So we got to get the basics done right to begin with before we can intensify things. A good goal is to try to get grazing extended all the way through the summer. If you've got a big gap in the summer, and we call that our, in the cool season forages world, we're calling that a summer slump, where our cool season forages tend to slow up in their growth rate. And if summer's dry and hot enough, they may actually go dormant for a while. So we need to be thinking that through. If we can get through the summer, that's great. Then the next goal ought to be to try to extend grazing season later into the fall, or perhaps the early part of the winter. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. If you don't take anything else away, I guess today from what I've talked about, this would be probably one of those things to take home with you, is to don't overgraze. If the lady that owns the farm where I took this picture knew that I took this picture, and have used it dozens of times over the years to show a really badly managed pasture, this would be it. It's grazed right down to the soil, and the pasture, that's going to convert the the species composition of forages over time, and they're going to be just probably not as productive. So we want to avoid overgrazing. When we overgraze, we basically ruined the plant's solar panel and its ability to generate energy. Then it has to take energy out of its roots and lower part of the stem, if there's anything there, to regrow. It may affect tiller initiation for the following season. These little bare spots, like I'm pointing to here with the cattle prod, that's opportunities right there for a weed to get growing. And we expose soil. So then when we expose soil, there's more potential for erosion, more potential for the soil to be too warm, maybe, which in a good part of the season, that could be a problem. It might slow our forage growth. It might slow the biological activity, et cetera. So we need to be thinking about that. And when we overgraze, if depending how long we let animals in a situation like that, we may compromise their performance because they graze, but they just physically can't consume enough forage to be able to optimize their productivity. So that's another thing, and it sort of gets to be a sort of a neglect situation. So we need to be thinking about that as well. So if you don't remember anything else that I've talked about today, just remember to try to not overgraze pastures. All right, browsing. I think it's a good option for a lot of farms. And again, that's speaking from my experience here in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of farms, especially in certain areas of the state, which are somewhat reverted. You know, they may have been used for farming, or somebody scratched a living off of it somehow back maybe 50 to 100 years ago, but then the economics of farming basically put them out of business, and the farms are kind of reverted. So we have a lot of situations where browsing small ruminants can be very viable on a lot of our farms here. We can use these, we can use sheep and goats to get that kind of work done. So we can clear out woodlots if we want to. We can clear reverted fields. We have species in this part of the country. I don't know if you have it there, but we have a species called multiflora rose and another one called autumn olive, which are problems. They're brushy perennials that can become problems in pastures, and farmers have been aggravated about them for decades and decades. So pastures which I see that have small ruminants in them don't have multiflora rose because they'll eat all the leaves, they'll eat the new growth, and do that a few years in a row, and the rose bushes disappear. When we're browsing, we have fewer issues with parasites, internal parasites or worms, because the animals are grazing up high and they're up above where those parasite larvae are going to be hanging out. And so we can't totally ignore the problem, but yet it's probably going to benefit us from that standpoint. Stocking rate is a bit of a question mark. That gets to be an experimental thing because the situations can vary quite a bit from farm to farm. What about weeds? We ask these questions a lot. I know my friends that work in weed science, they're always wanting us to kill all the weeds in pastures, and they tell us to get over the clover. And so we can kill all the broadleaf weeds and reestablish clover. And so their favorite line is, get over the clover, guys. But yet we know that we can use a lot of these weeds. A certain amount of weed pressure is okay. And again, it's going to depend a little bit on what species we're grazing, and small ruminants actually may do better at taking out a bunch of our broadleaf weed issues, at least that we experience here in Pennsylvania. So, but our goal needs to be really to have aggressive pasture growth that's going to choke out weed competition. Any places where, like I was pointing to in that slide back a few slides ago there, where we have exposed soil, that's a place for a weed to get growing, set up shop, and be able to be in there with the pasture. So if we're doing new seedings, it's a good time right then to get control of perennial weeds before we embark on doing a new seeding, and getting things done right through that whole seeding process is important to avoiding weed issues. There's a number of different herbicides that are available, so we can resort to herbicides if it's necessary. We can also use mechanical means such as mowing to suppress problem weeds and keep them from setting seed and reseeding back into the soil. And trying to graze weeds that when they're vetted is a good thing if we can do it that way. Years ago, I saw results, I think, of a research that a grad student had run a sampled nutritional value of probably two dozen different weeds that we have here in the East, and found that the nutritional quality of most of them was very, very good. They were in the vegetative stage. Any other forage, if it's native and palatable, and not, of course, it's going to be probably something that would be grazed and could be beneficial from a nutritional standpoint. A little bit of a summary here to understand the different rate and stocking density. So stocking rate is the bigger picture where we're talking about what happens for the whole season with our herd of sheep or goats or cattle. Occupation period on pasture. Some people fraction of a day to maybe as much as situation or context your life. 3-inch or greater residual to allow forages to quick grow, allowing adequate rest periods to allow the forages to rest, and avoiding overgrazing and just trying to keep things reasonably simple. We'll talk a little bit about reseeding. I think it's important when folks are thinking about reseeding a pasture is that we need to ask ourselves, do we really need to reseed it? Or could the stand be rescued with some action with a mower and maybe some herbicides and maybe some frost seeding some legumes into that? Is it possible? Could it be brought back to vitality? We also know that, at least again, I know here in Pennsylvania, we have in most places, a pretty good seed bank in the soil so that there's viable seed that's there, that's just been dormant in the soil for decades. Bluegrasses, for example, that if the opportunity were right, they would grow. Even though they've been there for decades, those seeds, if the opportunity is there, would grow. And I've known people that have actually brought reverted fields back into production and being able to work with just what grows from the soil from seed bank. And there was a study done on that years ago at Penn State where they just started grazing cattle on the corn fodder from a field that had been in corn the previous year, and they just grazed whatever grew for the next 2 or 3 years, and they quantified that. And at the end of 5 years or 3 years, whatever it was, they found that they had a number of different common forage species, grasses and legumes that showed up, and nothing was ever seeded. So it's possible to use some of the seed bank. Or we may need to resort to full renovation if the problems are something that just really, or we just need to take out the field and start again, or maybe just do a partial renovation. It's going to, vary. If you're uncomfortable with that decision, try to get some help from some professionals or other farmers that have experience in this and help decide whether or not you need to actually renovate it or whether something else might work. When to establish perennial pastures. I put a picture of my house, or that's our farmstead there in central PA is where I live. We're pretty much in the middle of the state. And it's a wintertime picture, of course. And of course, we aren't going to be seeding forages then, but I put the winter picture in to just sort of make the point that winter is the time we need to make some of these decisions. If we're talking about seeding forages in late summer, making that decision in the wintertime would be good so that we start the season knowing what we're going to do. And we need to do soil testing, have seed ordered, have a plan, and not decide in August what we're going to do later in August. For us here in Pennsylvania, these late summer seedings generally work the best. I think most of us that work in forage agronomy agree on this. We get less weed pressure at that time of year. We typically can, if we've had a dry summer, we can typically count on some moisture Even if it comes up the coast in the form of the remnants of a hurricane, we'll get some moisture in September, and the temperatures moderate a little bit, and we can often get a good forage establishment in late summer. We can do it this time of year if the soil conditions are right, and an early spring seeding is possible, but the later it gets into a spring seeding, the more issues we might have if we get into a dry summer, and the forage, the conditions get droughty before the forage has really established and rooted deeply, so that's a concern then. The other thing about that early, those springtime seedings is we get more issues that were basically there, the soil, seed is in the soil, and it's ready to grow with spring planted crops like corn or soybeans, that type of thing. So selecting forage mixtures. So typically we're looking at mixtures of grasses, legumes, forbs. Forbs is just sort of a term that we use to describe anything that's a broadleaf, I guess, that isn't a grass or a legume. A botanist might disagree with us a little bit on using that term, but in perennial pastures, we do have plants show up or sometimes being used as forages such as dandelion and plantain, which would not be a legume and it's not a grass. So they're kind of categorized under that forbs term. And but usually this is what we're looking at, mainly perennial grasses. And again, in our part of the country, the vast majority of what's being used here is cool season forages. So they grow a lot in the springtime into the early summer, then go much slower in growth, occasionally maybe dormant a little bit in the summertime, with another surge of growth, a smaller surge of growth in the late summer and early fall. We have a little bit of interest in warm season grasses here, such as switchgrass and blue stem. But those grasses take longer to establish. They don't establish as quickly as our cool season grasses. Once the warm season grasses do establish, they are pretty persistent if they're managed correctly. If you have questions on forage mixtures, the decisions on what mix to use often is based, again, on things that are in the context of your farm. What are your soils like? Are they well drained? Are they heavy wet soils? Are they cold soils facing north, or whatever the situation may be? If you aren't sure what to do, talk to professionals that are in the seed industry. That most of the companies, at least distributors that we talk to here in the East, have mixtures already made, and they're tweaked for different purposes. And so we can get some agronomic help from people with tech service with the companies to help us, to guide us to the right products or mixtures that might work best on our farm if we're actually doing a reseeding. I'm a proponent of legumes, so I try to get folks to try to foster legumes in our pastures. And again, in our part of the country here, we're looking at white clover, alfalfa, birchfoot trefoil, and red clover would be our most common legumes here. I put a question mark after red clover because being that this is a talk directed towards folks with small ruminants, there are some what would be termed as estrogenic or estrogen-like compounds in our clovers, but in particular red clover, which can impact the estrus cycle of sheep and goats. And it's been one of those things that we probably should have our small ruminant specialists comment on that here in the panel discussion to see what the latest thinking is on that issue. I've talked to people that have had problems with this, but farms where people have a 200% lambing and have a lot of red clover. So maybe there's more to be learned, or maybe there's some differences in what time you're breeding and some things like that as far as the impact of that. We can talk about that a little bit later. Agronomic benefits, though, of legumes would be, of course, they'll what we call nitrogen. So, there's a species of bacteria or a genus called rhizobia, and a species within that that's unique to each of these legumes that'll colonize the roots on these plants and be able to assimilate nitrogen out of the rhizosphere. So that provides nitrogen to the legumes, and also some of the nitrogen sloughs off and it's picked up by grasses and helps the grasses to grow better as well. Also having, different types of plants within a mixture like this is really good. That diversity is going to help us. They're not all susceptible to the same diseases. They may tolerate different soil drainages and things like that, different idiosyncrasies about the soil. So that where one plant tends to fail, another one may be able to thrive. There's some nutritional advantages as well to having legumes in our mixtures with our grasses. It's important to understand. And drought, again, we're using these species here, and they tend to grow not quite as aggressively in the springtime, but they'll grow, or not quite as aggressively as our perennial grasses in the spring, but a little bit more aggressively than our perennial grasses during the summer. So what I tell people is it tends to smooth out the growth curves a little bit with our grasses, and sort of stretches the grazing a little bit for us into the summertime, and it can help us to get through that summer slump. Frost seeding, and I don't know if this is something that is talked about in Idaho or not, but we work on it here quite a bit in Pennsylvania. Basically, we'll go out and spin clover seeds on the soil in the late part of the winter when the soil is freezing at night, but then it thaws out when the sun comes up during the daytime, and it'll freeze back up overnight. For us, late February, early March is that time frame when this works. And we don't recommend using alfalfa to do this, but we do recommend clovers. And doesn't work all the time, but it's an inexpensive way to get seed out there. And what I've found over the years is, even if I spun seed on here a couple of months ago at the end of February, and it didn't work this year for some reason, the seed is often, the majority of it is still viable. It's there in the soil, and the conditions may be right for it next year to grow, and it'll get established. So we have to be thinking about that. It's an expensive way to get some legumes into that pasture system. Some summary here: seeding and reseeding. Start that process well ahead of time. Have a plan. Be thinking that a half a year ahead, probably, to have a strategy on what you want to do, get the soil testing done, that sort of thing. If we have perennial weeds, that's a great time to control them. If we're going to reseed a pasture, any of these perennials need to be dealt with before we spend the money to reseed. Do we need to renovate? That's a question. May not be the case. That's to be decided. Making sure our pH and fertility are optimal. So we've got to, again, we've soil tested. So if our pH needs to be adjusted, that can be done after testing. Purchasing quality seed that's been tested. It's low in weed content, for example. That would be a good recommendation there. Seeding at the right time of the year for your part of the state. Understand what that time is, and pay attention to details while seeding. It's a lot of money to lay out there, and if we don't do things right and it fails, we've wasted not only money but also time and opportunity. All right, the last section, this third piece here, is on extending the grazing season. So if we've managed all the aspects well during the growing season, we should be able to add some extra days to the grazing season. All right, we've treated our forages well, and they've grown strongly for us, hopefully been able to add some days onto the end. There's some other things we can do, other options to extend the grazing season, throughout the year. And I like to use this kind of a cool looking little graphic here that one of our forage specialists actually had put together a few years ago. It just kind of shows us what our options are. And again, this may not be totally applicable in your city. This is what we use here. And if we're looking in throughout the course of the year, let's start right here in April. We're at the point right now where our cool season perennials are really starting to grow. And we've had some days here this week where temperatures in the low 70s, and we've got the moisture. And so the cool season grasses and legumes are off and running. And so they're going to peak though sometime there in June, and then bottom out a little bit in the summertime and have a more of a bump of growth there later in the summer. But we've got some other possibilities. We have warm season annuals we may be able to add in here during that slump. We have some cool season annuals that might be able to be seeded later in the year, or seeded here to be able to be grazed late in the season into the early part of the winter. And then we'll talk a little bit about this concept of stockpiling here in just a minute, but that's another possibility. So stockpiling is when we use that term in the forage world to describe using cool season perennial grasses. Mainly tall fescue is what we use here, and in the fescue belt, where this forage is the primary forage grass that grows. And in Pennsylvania, to stockpile, here's basically how it works. We're going to start the process early. It's going to be like probably the early part of August, ideally. And, you know, we go in at that point in time, we quit grazing on that field. We may apply some nitrogen to it to jumpstart that growth. And we just allow it to grow until the end of the grazing season, or the end of the growing season, rather. And then we can use it during outside the growing season. We can continue our grazing season into the wintertime and be able to begin grazing whenever we need that forage. We can strip graze it out. We don't have to worry about a back fence because it's not going to regrow, because like I'm showing with my steers, I've grass finished a small number of steers each year. And I don't actively stockpile forage, but they happen to be out on a little piece here that had some tall fescue growing on it, and they were just sort of poking around that day. But this can be what it looks like to be grazing stockpiled forages during the wintertime. And the forage quality deteriorates very slowly. And again, I can just whip through this slide here for you pretty quickly. We've already talked about this, but we're basically starting early, allowing 70 to 90 days before the end of our fall growing season. We applied some nitrogen, since we're talking about mainly grass here, and allow the forage to grow uninterrupted for a minimum of 70 days to the time that the growing season ends, which again, for us here in central PA, is going to be about the end of October. This is some work that was done a number of years ago that just shows the TDN, or total digestible nutrients, or the way energy can be measured in forages, and crude protein. You understand protein, and how these nutritional aspects stack up in stored forages. TDN of hay right here, and TDN of stockpiling here. And you can kind of see that, you know, we actually start off with hay that has more energy in it, higher TDN level for a good part of that winter grazing compared to the hay that's at 60%. So, and then when it comes to protein, same thing. We can start out with a hay that's just a dry grass hay at 10% protein. And it's going to take quite a while for that protein level in the stockpiled forage to deteriorate to the point where it's the same as the stored hay that we're using. Just a general rule of thumb when stockpiling, about an acre per animal unit being 1,000 pounds, is going to give us hopefully about 75 days of feed supply. Disadvantages, and this is the one we run into here in Pennsylvania all the time. We can talk to people about extending the grazing season using stockpiling till we're blue in the face. But the problem is most of us don't own enough land or have access to enough fenced land that work for much of the winter. We can do it. I've known people here that have grazed livestock well into towards the end of January. And we run out of land, and our land here, typically farms now into the state are selling for $10,000 an acre or more with buildings, and probably $8,000 without. So it becomes prohibitive to go out and buy more land just to have some to stockpile. We don't have a lot of land in this part of the country that's fenced already. So that's another thing. But with sheep and goats, with these net fencing materials, we do have, that does open up doors to using land or maybe residual growth on a field or something like that with temporary fencing materials. So that's something to keep in mind. Stockpiling does an investment of some time, some management. You can shut it down. You know, I've read a number of articles over the years about people in the Midwest or southern part of the Midwest doing really serious stockpiling. And this is what they always say, is that they can go through some snow with livestock, but ice will shut it down in a hurry. So you have to have a contingency plan if you use this, and be ready to do some supplemental feeding if you get an ice storm. Interseeding, and I don't know if you've heard of this concept or not. Here, Penn State, we've been doing some research with these tools for a number of years, which will go in, specially designed machine. It can go in between corn rows and actually seed forage species, annual species such as annual ryegrass, cereal rye, in between corn rows, and allow that to get established and grow. And then when we take corn off or take corn silage off, it opens up and those forages are already there and established and really ready to take off. So this is something that I put here, working together with a corn grower would be something to keep in mind, because not everybody that has a small flock of sheep or goats or cattle is going to want to go out and buy a machine like this, but it might be possibilities of hooking up with a corn grower and maybe working a deal where we could rent one of these types of machines and go into the field and establish some forage crops between the corn rows like that we could graze sheep on at some point later in the season. Years ago, this concept has been around for a long time, but these machines have been more recent in their development. But many years ago, an Amish farmer told me that, he said, when I was a kid, he said, Dad would just set me up on a horse facing towards the horse's tail, facing back, and I would be holding a seed spinner. And he says he would walk the horse down the corn rows, and I would spin annual grass seed onto the cornfield as we walked through it while I was sitting on top of a horse. So what they were doing was they were establishing a forage and interseeding into that cornfield. And when the corn came off as silage in September, they had some grazing there that was ready to go pretty soon after that for their cattle. So it's pointing out here, can be done in a simpler way on a smaller scale. This is what this kind of thing can look like. These are some pictures I took a few years ago, some work that was done on farms in central Pennsylvania, establishing interseed crops in cornfields. A little bit about annual crops for extending the grazing season. So season and annuals. Right here, they're referred to sometimes summer annuals or winter annuals. Good to have in your toolbox to provide for a sort Chad, did you lose me?
Yeah, we lost you for a second. If you're able to share your slides again, that'd be great.
Yep. Hang on here a minute. I'll figure out how to. Can you see that?
I can't see your slides yet. No.
Okay.
There we go.
See it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's back where I was at. We're talking about warm season and cool season annual crops to be used that we can use at strategic points during the season to extend our grazing, whether that would be through the summer months or into the early part of the winter, or in the case of these winter annuals, they could be grazed early in the winter or perhaps the following spring if they overwinter. Cereal rye, triticale, crops like that, annual ryegrass would overwinter and be available the following spring. Oats, again, in this part of the country, we use oats in the fall for grazing. It makes a nice grazing crop, but it winter kills, so we can't count on that in the springtime. Just a brief list there of some of the warm season annuals that are possibilities And again, this may differ depending where you are at, but for us here in the East, Sudan grass, forage sorghums are some of the, or hybrids thereof, and pearl millets becoming more popular here. And corn, these are all grasses basically that would fit in. Even soybeans might be another option. Cool season crops, and again, cereal rye and annual rye grass, as well as wheat. Triticale, of course, is a hybrid of cereal rye and wheat, and oats would be good possibilities here. Establishing those annuals, late spring to early summer establishment, again, for us here, for our warm season annuals, and then late summer to fall establishment for the cool season. This could involve no-till like we're looking at here in the picture, or perhaps tillage. Again, that's going to depend on your situation, what kind of equipment's available to you to get that type of work done. Maybe could be working as part of a renovation. Perhaps we want to take a field out, a pasture that's gotten overrun with some weed issues or something, and we're going to renovate it. Perhaps the first thing we do is actually kill that field and go in with an annual some type and have a little bit long process to the renovation to work with. Crop residues was one of the final things I wanted to mention. In Pennsylvania, our big by far option of crop residue for us to use livestock on in general would burn fodder. And so it still isn't really all that common. I do see a little bit of it here and there with cattle mainly, but you could, again, you could bring small ruminants into this picture as well. But typically what we observe livestock to do in this situation, they'll go in and are pretty good at picking up grain that fell out of the combine or didn't make it into the combine head. Then they'll eat husks, then go to leaves, and then if they have to, stalks. And so depending where you are at, there may be other types of residues that are available to you. It's a matter of understanding the cropping industry in your area, what kind of crops are grown there, and is there residues, or maybe even just residual growth in hay fields, maybe something that's available to you. Apply that. Understand the nutritional value of that feed source. And so for us with corn stalks, we would tell people that you need to be paying attention on this, because if we would graze this residue too long and we forced our livestock to graze down to just corn stalks, we could become deficient, not only in energy, but also protein even, if we allow that to go on too long without some supplemental feeds. So it's something to consider. It's a possibility to extend the grazing season, but we've got to be paying attention to the nutrition. So brief summary on that. To extend the grazing season, I mean, it can be an active thing such as stockpiling, interseeding, using annuals at key times of the year, or perhaps crop residues if there's something available close to where we're located. So that is all that I have put together, Chad. So turn it back to you, I guess, and then we can go from there. This is my contact information. Wants to contact me, whatever, that's fine. This is where I reached.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. We really appreciate it. That was pretty insightful to kind of give us a bunch of tools that we can utilize in order to extend our grazing season and things like that. So along with David's information there, you're also all free to contact myself, Dr. Ellison, Carmen, or Dr. Stewart at the University of Wyoming. And I'll be putting up our information in just a bit. But I think now we'll go into some questions, David. And currently we have a handful of questions for you, kind of everything ranging from some mechanical type management to some seeding and things like that. So one of the first things that we got was eliminating some forage species. So is there any way to eliminate foxtail or barley grass out of a pasture?
I'm familiar with foxtail. We have problems with that here. Barley grass, I'm not familiar with. I say this much, and that there's a new herbicide I think that's going to be approved, that they're, I think, expecting it to be registered, called Resilon, I think it is. That, and I saw something about this the other day or the other evening. It can take out some of these annual grasses from a grass pasture. Okay. So in other words, taking out from the weed control standpoint with a herbicide, taking a grass out of a grass has not been typically in the cards. But this product is supposedly able to do that. And I know that foxtail was on the list. I don't think this is available yet, but that's something that you may want to check into a little bit further with some of your local sources. So at this time, being that foxtail, again, is an annual, I tell people is do whatever you can do to try to keep it. Every time it sets seed, it just puts more into the seed bank of the soil that's going to grow next time around, or maybe 10 years from now when the conditions are right for those seeds, and just continue giving us a problem. So if we can manage things to clip off seed heads on these annual weeds, that really helps us to be able to keep this suppressed.
Yeah. One thing that I've learned in my limited education with plant physiology and whatnot is that it really kind of depends on the plant, on the way you have to go about attacking it or managing it. Right, David?
Yeah.
So I think understanding each plant, can't all treat them the same.
That's right. Having an understanding of that plant and its growth cycle. And again, the barley, I'm not familiar with that one, but foxtail is a summer annual. And, so it's going to come up a little bit later in the springtime and make its appearance. And then all of a sudden puts out that seed at some point during the summer. And if we can keep it from setting seed, that's important, especially with annuals. Some suppression like that goes a long ways.
Yeah. So another question you have is about, should we trim pastures when we move our livestock? And so I guess the way I read this is more of a mechanical trim. How do you read this question? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and people debate that and discuss it, and it's kind of one of those things that gets to be a little bit controversial, and it depends a little bit on your grazing management as to what you do. So again, from my experience here in Pennsylvania with cool season perennial grasses mainly, most of our cool season perennial grasses here want to put out a seed head sometime in late May or early June. So once that plant puts out a seed head, it sort of sits still and doesn't grow much. It'll just sort of maintain itself. And if we clip it, we can reset that plant to a vegetative state. And then the rest of the season, it won't try to produce a seed head. It'll just grow vegetatively and make really good. Some people will tell me, well, I can do that with cattle. By bunching them up real tight into a high density graze situation and applying a high density to it and allowing the cattle to really trump the residual forage into the ground and sort of reset it that way. And that's possible. I think there are people that can do that. So it all depends on what you're trying to do. I mentioned earlier, I finished some grass finished cattle at home. And I want them on the highest quality forage that I can produce all the time. I don't want to have to put them on stuff that's really marginal with a lot of seed heads. So regular practice at my place would be, after I move cattle from a paddock, starting like June 1st, I will clip that down to maybe 3-4 inches, 5 inches, something like that. And then that paddock is good to go the rest of the season. It would not need to be clipped again unless there's a specific weed issue maybe. but the forage grasses will stay vegetative from that point on. And so that's what I would say. It's certainly not something that needs to be done after every grazing rotation. Every time you move livestock, I wouldn't recommend clipping. It gets to be so much labor and so much expense that I just don't, it's not practical. We should be able to do the management without that and apply it on just a very limited basis.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. Oftentimes the most, economic way to harvest any feed stuff is allowing the animal to do it, right? So if we're going to talk purely input and output economics, I would fully agree with you. Talk about some of the cover crops and things like that. Are cover crops cost effective? In other words, for this seed purchase, equipment, fuel, sheep care, fence, less expensive, which results in a profitable sheep operation. So and have you done much cover crop work like that, looking at the economics of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we started doing crop work here, serious cover crop, probably about 15 years ago now. And that was one of the questions we get frequently. What does it pay? It's going to cost me 40 or 50 bucks an acre to put out this cover crop without grazing. And pictures just from the cropping standpoint. And it's very hard to tease out the economic part of that. Okay, we can put a value on how much nitrogen is produced by some cover crops, okay? But then we have all these other things that we know cover crop can do. Save soil, we know can help us in weed control, we know can help the general soil health, we know it can sequester nutrients that maybe were lost, maybe bring nutrients up from lower in the soil profile so they're available for our crop. And we just know that there's all these other benefits, but they're very hard to put a value on. And even now, a number of years later, I still haven't seen really good economic analysis of that. Although I know a lot of farmers who have been using cover crops a lot of years that are very adamant that they feel that it's money spent. And so now that said, that's just, again, from the cropping standpoint. Now, if we'd add grazing into that picture, to me, that's like taking to that next step, epitome of bringing it full cycle, grazing back in and using the cover crop as a forage source, in addition to protecting the soil and sequestering nutrients and maybe providing nitrogen. To me, that seems like it should be much more likely to be economically viable. But again, everybody's situation is different. And if you're a smaller operation and you can't justify owning the machinery to establish cover crops, their machinery custom hire or their machine, maybe not. So everybody's situation is a little bit different. And when it might pay for one person, it may not pay for somebody else. But I think that adding grazing in it just seems like, to me, brings it much closer to being something that should be economically feasible to do.
Yeah, and I think some of that is also calculating out expected revenue, right? So there's maybe some years, our revenue on our lambs may not be as much as other years. And so maybe it would be harder to justify some of that based on our input. But I think those are things we should probably all kind of calculate on a case-to-case scenario. So,
yep. Right.
So I really liked your comment on, I try to explain to the students I teach in my sheep classes and animal science classes here at Utah State University, the differences in grazing, and browsing between cattle, sheep, and goats. And I talked about some of the same things you did, but for maybe some of our producers that have goats on operations that maybe don't have as much browse, are there things that they can do to try to establish maybe different plants or trees or things like that that can allow those more browse type species like goats to do more of that.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, huh?
That's a good question. And I don't know. I'm not aware of anything here. It could be done. I mean, I'm sure there's things, it just would depend how long you would be willing to wait for a plant to go through its growth cycle to get big enough to make suitable amount of browse. I do see occasionally about people using locust trees and some things like that for some forage. But again, that's, I think, cutting limbs off and allowing especially sheep or goats to come along and eat the leaf area from the limbs that were dropped down off those plants. But it takes several years to get trees big enough to do that. So it's, that's a good question. And I've never, don't remember seeing any articles about people actively establishing brushy vegetation. It's always been from the standpoint of going in and cleaning up places that were overgrown, or we didn't even talk about this, but or doing like targeted grazing on a fee basis for taking care of abandoned building sites or power line right-of-ways or vineyards or solar farms or fire breaks, any of those kind of things, or other opportunities for using, especially small ruminants, really good at that type of stuff. And again, I know the fire breaks and that sort of thing's a much bigger business out your way than it is here, but we're getting more questions on using sheep to maintain solar farms, and some questions on using sheep or goats to take noxious weeds out of parks, for example, where herbicides just don't work well for very long, and it's expensive, difficult to apply in those situations, and have a lot of people around. So in some of those situations with parks, there's more opportunity, it seems like, to browse sheep or goats to allow them to do the work, and for the goat owner, make that into a business. So as far as actively establishing, I just have to say I'm not sure. I really don't know.
I think that's a pretty difficult question, David. I think of the goats we had growing up, and on the small acreage we have, I think it would have been pretty difficult to get trees or some other things established in the areas we would want them in without removing the goats entirely from that area for a pretty significant amount of time. So I think that also kind of comes back to what are your resources, and sometimes choosing the species that's best suited for your environment is a good idea too. It's hard though, because when many of us only have a few animals or smaller operation, a lot of the times we choose that animal that we like best, right? We don't always choose the animal that maybe is best suited for our environment, whether it's goats or sheep or cows, or, I get a lot of people even with horses that want to figure out some grazing program. And so I think thinking about the species and what resources you have and which one matches best is a good practice also.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. That's a lot of truth in that. And yeah.
And so, but I think I grew up in Arizona, and there were a lot of times that, I'd go with my grandpa and we'd drop off some sheep at someone's house who just had weeds overgrown. And I think there's, maybe if it's not a full-time business, you can always look for opportunities to bring goats or sheep somewhere else for a given amount of time. And so just all about communicating with people.
I have a friend.
So.
Yeah. Yep. I have a friend that had a flock in the county next door, and he got approached by somebody that had a couple of acres where there used to be farm buildings or something like that. And places like that can be dangerous to try to mow because there's hidden pieces of concrete, foundations, or maybe wells that are grown over and you don't see them. There's a lot of hazards to try to mow places like that. So he got asked to bring his sheep in, and using net fencing, he was able to do that. And I didn't charge people, but he just looked at it as extending his grazing on another property. Then the next person asked him, and then another one, and another one. But he said his sheep would get so used to going place to place that all he had to do was pull him with his trailer and open up the back of it, and they'd jump right in and be ready to go to the next farm.
Yeah,
So, it's interesting.
I've even heard of some people who make a business out of it with goats, that they get to the point where they're not even culling, animals for slaughter. They're just keeping everything around, and they're using those old nannies to teach all the young animals what to graze, where to graze, and they do pretty well for themselves. Of course, that's a full-time job. Then you're herding animals in urban areas, which can be difficult with people walking dogs and things like that. So it's it has its own challenges,
Yes.
So, well, we have one more question for you, David. Is there anything that can be no-tilled into fescue for summer grazing? And if so, is there any advantage to this, or is fescue too competitive?
That's a good question. Yeah. So that interplanting, I forget what the official term is. So trying to establish cool season annual forages into warm season perennials is done some in the South, and that's pretty successful. But some forage scientists in the North have tried to work on no-tilling summer annuals into cool season perennials, which is what you're talking about, would be establishing season annual into a cool season perennial. Been much more difficult. And in Pennsylvania, there's been research done on establishing Sudan grass and also pearl millet into cool season perennial. Now, I can't say this fescue. It was probably more of an orchard grass based forage mixture. But where they found that it worked the best was if they suppressed it with just a cut rate of herbicide, just enough that it would set the perennial back just a little bit, but it wouldn't kill it. It would stun it just a little and allow that warm season annual to establish. And then it could grow during the summer, be up above the perennial, and could be grazed. And then but the perennial recovers then in the fall and will be back growing again the next spring. So, but that's been difficult. They've found in their research studies at Penn State that they haven't been able to make it very well by not using a herbicide. If let's say we just used grazing pressure and really grazed it really hard down to the ground and suppressed it that way, they still find that it probably was not worth trying to establish there. So that work has been done here. Now, talking about specifically fescue, which is an aggressive grower, I haven't seen studies which looked at that in particular. And I'm lucky, we have fescue here, not necessarily part of the fescue belt. We're talking about states just sort of to the south and southwest of me. So Virginia, West Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, big fescue states. So where you'd want to look probably to learn more about that would be University of Missouri would be a good place. I know that they've done a lot of research there involving tall fescue over the years. And one of the things that they've found, I think in general with fescue, if they can get red clover going with it, agronomically, it seems to work pretty well. They can continue to establish red clover with it. And I think that they've recently isolated through research that there's a compound within red clover which tends to mitigate the problems caused by the fescue or the endophyte or the fungus growing within fescue. I forget the compound, but there's some physiological aspect to it from the animal standpoint. So red clover tends to be what I think they're promoting as the species to grow with the tall fescue, tend to mitigate some of its problems and give us some summer growth. So that's, that's what I would know about it.
Okay. Well, man, I wish I had some of that knowledge of plants that you do. But we really appreciate having you on today. It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. So we'll probably wrap up this session of the webinar. And all of you who've logged in today, please feel free to contact David if you have any questions about grazing or pasture management. He's a wealth of knowledge. And or myself, Dr. Ellison from the University of Idaho, along with Carmen and Dr. Whit Stewart from the University of Wyoming. We thank you all again for joining us and have a nice day. Thank you.